everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Christie has suspended his bid for president. He made the announcement today in front of supporters in Windham, New Hampshire, telling them that it was clear to him that there was no path for him to win the Republican nomination, but also vowing to do everything he could to make sure former President Trump wasn't president again. That leaves former President Donald Trump, Governor Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Asa Hutchinson left in the race. Ed O'Keefe and Finn Gomez join us now. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Finn is CBS News' political director. In my conversations with those close to Governor Christie, it's been said to me that if there comes an endorsement, it will probably be after the Iowa caucuses to see, for example, just how well Nikki Haley does or doesn't do.
Right.
Exactly. And speaking about Nikki Haley, in that same CNN New Hampshire poll that I cited, she was within striking distance of Donald Trump, 7 points, right, Ed?
Yep.
Between her and the front runner. And if you look at those Christie netting 12 points in that poll, one would imagine that a lot of his support would be potentially going to Nikki Haley.
And that's why you've seen him now, Major, in the last few days, unleash another round of attack ads on New Hampshire airwaves, why he's been making baseless claims about her online, why he has been calling her out in his speeches here in Iowa last weekend. It was quite striking that in his first extended comments about the second defamation case from that author, E. Jean Carroll, for example, he went on a long screed denying the allegations and ended it by suggesting that one of the people helping E. Jean Carroll fund her legal effort is also someone who's been donating to Nikki Haley's super PAC, leaving that sort of pregnant pause in the room to suggest maybe Nikki Haley's behind my legal problems. I mean, that's how he is now trying to dissuade support for her among Republicans, or at least get his supporters riled up enough to start lashing out at her. Familiar, we've seen this many times before, but it's clear now he feels he's probably done enough to do away with Ron DeSantis and has to stop Haley's rise in New Hampshire.
And it seems to me, gentlemen, worth pointing out to our audience that for most of this campaign, it has been radio silence from the Trump campaign vis-a-vis Nikki Haley. The occasional jab here and there, but nothing as consistent as we've seen in the last 48 hours. That tells me, as I'm sure it tells you, they're seeing something and they want to combat it as aggressively as they can.
Absolutely. And and also if you look, a great indicator, Major, is of course that big ad buy they purchased in New Hampshire, in the Granite State, attacking Nikki Haley. If you noticed in the last town hall that she had on CNN, there was this big social media attack essentially by the campaign, by Trump allies against Haley, which is also an indicator that they see her as a growing threat.
And in Iowa, Christie was not a factor. He's never tried to be a factor. He's not going to change the conversation in Iowa. But in your sense of things, having been there for a couple of days, do you think that the anticipated sense that Republicans might have, well, Christie is out, that might mean something in New Hampshire, might, by coincidence or just by adding two together, help Haley in Iowa?
It could. It absolutely could, Major, especially based on the conversations we were having with voters who showed up at our event yesterday, as basic as that kind of reporting may seem, because they're looking for somebody other than Trump. They agree with the premise of Haley and Ron DeSantis's argument, which is if we go with Trump again, the whole year will be about January 6th, civil suits that he faces, allegations of harassment, the nasty things he's said about people. It won't be an opportunity to prosecute the case against President Biden. Or as Nikki Haley says, chaos follows him wherever he goes, and we can't afford 4 more years of chaos. If they see the field starting to dwindle down to these big three, they might think, okay, I've seen the polling that suggests in a general election matchup, she's the only one right now that defeats President Biden. I see her starting to gain in New Hampshire. I see Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump being the only other options. I like her. Are there enough Haley-style, more mainstream, traditional conservative Republicans, however, in this state anymore? I don't think so, not based on what I've observed. They do exist in an open primary system in New Hampshire where independents and even Democrats can show up the day of. participate. But out here, where it's essentially a Republican or register that day to be a Republican kind of event, it would be harder for her to prevail. But look, 5 days, guys, as we know, is a long time. And we've always said, on this program especially, this election is poised to break late. Perhaps this is the beginning of that late breaking.
And also, it's worth having a conversation. We've talked about Trump, we've talked about Haley, we've talked about Christie. Let's dive in a bit on DeSantis. This seems to me, the time between now and Monday, as important as any 5 days for the DeSantis campaign. If anything is going to work, it needs to work now so he can surprise on the upside in Iowa, because all of the general conversation is DeSantis is down. The sense of energy and optimism around his campaign is flagging. He could come in third. It could be his undoing. What is your sense about DeSantis and the next 5 days?
But, Major, that's the conversation outside Iowa. You talk to Republicans here in Iowa, you'll see this in the coming days. Major, you'll see it in the coming days. And they'll say, DeSantis has built a formidable operation by way of his super PAC, Never Back Down, which has been doing this since the spring. They say they were knocking on doors. They were getting names and numbers. They have been taking commit to caucus cards, which give you all the contact information you need for somebody. And they point out there are more than 1,600 precincts across this state, more than 700 caucus sites. They have more than 1,500 precinct captains. They've got somebody to speak at just about every single caucus site. Who else probably does, based on what we've been told by his campaign? The former president. But it seems far more methodical, scientific, and surgical on the DeSantis side. And that is how Iowa caucuses have been won before, by Ted Cruz, by Rick Santorum, back in the day when it was a little different, by George W. Bush. So here in Iowa, people can see DeSantis has built a serious enough operation. Nobody, though, says he's going to win it, so it's just a question of how close could you get to the former president, or does something in the next few days that Haley's up to perhaps find her way to get close enough to them? But she doesn't have that kind of operation here.
Yeah, absolutely, and as you know, Major, and as Ed noted, it is about the grassroots operation here in the Hawkeye State. Iowans want to see their potential, their candidates. They want to see they want to meet and talk to them at diners and speak to them. And I think that you have seen, Ron DeSantis, he's done a full grass. He's gone to all 99 counties. They really are focusing on that part of this campaign. And also, as Ed noted, it's about expectations. I was big about expectations. If DeSantis does better than expected, or if Nikki Haley does better than expected, if she does a close third or even comes in second in Iowa, that could really propel her and give her some momentum going into New Hampshire, which we just talked about, is where she's showing very strongly in recent polling. But, I mean, it could also propel her down the line and through the cycle, potentially.
And, Ed, I want you to help our audience with a brief tutorial about how the caucus works, because you talked about precinct captains. Our audience should think about the caucus as kind of a caucus with a small straw poll inside of it, correct? Basically, you gather in designated areas. There's a brief speech by each representative for each campaign. Then people lay down their preference. Those numbers are collected. A result is therefore produced statewide. Do I have that just about right?
Yeah, you do. Well done. It's like you've done this before, Major. But that is what it is. It starts in these very small group settings. I was at a practice the other night of 40 Republicans who were rehearsing. And these 40 Republicans are set to go back to their precincts and run the caucuses. So they'll be joined by a dozen, 3 dozen more in their neighborhoods. They count them all up there. Paper ballot, right? Secret ballot, but paper. They turn it into somebody at the front of the room who counts them all up. Well, we got 40 of us here, 40 of us counted total. Here's our result. They phone that up to the county level, that reports it up to the state level, that then reports it to the world. But here's the other interesting thing. 3 million people in this state. Small state, comparatively, certainly to New Jersey and other big ones. 186,000 Republicans in this state participated in 2016, the last competitive one. That was only a third of registered Republicans in this tiny state of 3 million. So this incredibly small group of Americans has this incredibly outsized role in beginning the process of picking a president. And most of them tonight will see Christie drop out. and think nothing of it. It will have no effect on them here because he hasn't been playing here at all. So, you know, we'll just have to wait and see. It is the most Byzantine way either party picks a presidential preference at this point. It's one that even Republicans concede may have to go away in the coming years because of pressure from the rest of the Republican Party to either do it differently or to not be first anymore. But it is something that requires, again, time, personnel, and lots of money to do it right. And the only two operations we've seen so far that have that are the Trump one and the DeSantis one, with Haley showing up here hoping that the tailwinds from everywhere else in the country somehow give her some kind of last-minute boost here.
Yeah, and speaking to Haley's sources, though, go ahead, Major.
No, go ahead, Finn. Go ahead.
No, just speaking to Haley's sources, you know, they will argue, and they have said that even though they may not have that the operation of some of her rivals, what they do have is they have they have the Koch brothers operation. They have they were backed by AFP. She was backed by AFP. Americans for Prosperity. And they do have a ground operation here. Yes, it's not as big. It's not as large, perhaps, as Trump's or DeSantis's operations, but they believe that it's enough for them to potentially do well here on Monday night. Another factor that we haven't spoken about, but I know that you and the three of us have discussed before, is the weather here. Oh. It is freezing right now. It is so cold. However, you know, on Monday we're expecting it to be a high of -5, according to the Weather Channel. In speaking to some Trump sources, they believe that will only benefit them because they have the more ardent support, if you will, here in Iowa. He does lead by double digits, a very wide margin still. So for them, they believe that that fervent base that they have here will come out despite the weather, but it could dissuade some of the other rival support, if you will, on Monday.
On Sunday, CBS News' Margaret Brennan will preview the Iowa caucuses at 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. Eastern. And on Monday, please join me at 5 p.m. Eastern for an up-to-minute coverage of the Iowa caucuses right here on CBS News. Next, our political panel joins us to assess how Christie suspending his campaign might impact the 2024 race. You are streaming America Decides. Christie suspended his 2024 presidential campaign tonight. Mara Gillespie and Chuck Rocha join me now here at the table. Mara previously served as an advisor to former House Speaker John Boehner and Congressman Adam Kinzinger. She's now founder of BlueStack Strategies. Chuck is a Democratic strategist who serves as the president of Solidarity Strategies. He was an advisor for Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. Mara, it is, of course, my obligation to start with you as the resident Republican at the table. Your thoughts, your reaction.
Fellow New Jerseyan.
Yes, fellow New Jerseyan. I didn't know that, but I know that now.
So I'm glad to see this. I think it's the time to do so.
Why are you glad?
I think what Christie's goal has always been was to, even though he said it was to win, was also to ensure that Trump didn't get the nomination. And at this point, he's seeing the poll numbers, and Nikki Haley has, really closed the gap between her and Trump as far as New Hampshire goes. And with him polling in at around 12%, those numbers going to Nikki Haley, which I believe a large chunk of them would go to her, that puts her ahead of Donald Trump in New Hampshire. So it's a beneficial time. And then you kind of look and see where does it go from there as far as Nevada, South Carolina, Michigan. And I think this is the time to do it. I don't think that he's going to throw his support behind Nikki Haley right now. He's made that kind of clear that he's not interested in doing that. But those who are supporting Christie are going to look for a candidate that's going to be firm on our foreign policy, that's going to stand up and differentiate from Donald Trump. And right now, who's left in the race to do that but Nikki Haley? And
so from your perspective, even if Christie doesn't say, I endorse Nikki Haley, whether that's tomorrow, the next day, the day after the Iowa caucuses, most of those New Hampshire supporters who were thinking about Christie will do the math themselves?
Well, and I think
and shift to Haley?
I think they will shift to Haley if they don't shift to Biden. There are probably some of those who may shift back to Biden. So it's not a guarantee that that 12% will go to her, but it won't go to another candidate in the GOP field.
Right. It won't go to DeSantis. It won't go to anywhere else. So it may not be Nikki Haley plus 12 from Christie. It may be plus 8.
But I think a large chunk of it could go to her.
Right.
And that's a benefit to her.
And what she needs and what any candidate needs in the closing days of a contested battle for the nomination is you need to be adding, not subtracting.
Absolutely.
And you believe this will help add for Nikki Haley, at least in New Hampshire.
Yes.
How about, and I want to ask you this, because you can find this in the polls and you can certainly find it when you talk to Republicans outside of New Hampshire. South Carolina would be the next most important place. They can't stand Chris Christie, and they're not going to listen to him no matter what, especially when he dumps on Trump.
So it's beneficial that he doesn't endorse Nikki Haley, right, in that scenario as well. So, again, I think what he talked about as far as ambition shouldn't be what governs your decision-making. I wish that message would get out there to everyone who's looking to run for office or is currently in the House GOP. As we've seen today, ambition seems to be what driving factor for a lot of members. But as far as this race, the GOP field, I think what he is trying to get at is that Donald Trump can't be our candidate, and I hope that those who are supporting him will turn towards Nikki Haley.
Chuck, your sentiments as you watch this play out.
You know, I've been running campaigns for a long time, and I've been on both sides of this, right? Sometimes the numbers just don't add up. It's just math. And he's doing what he's been saying he'd do from the beginning, is try to do what he can do to make sure Donald Trump's not the nominee. And that's what you have to do today if your numbers are where they're at.
Is now the time to do it?
I think so, because as you go into Iowa, I know we've all been talking about New Hampshire because independents can vote, Democrats can vote. In Iowa, I heard you talking to the crew earlier on the ground there in the freezing tundra of Iowa, where I remember a year ago in this same cowboy hat, me and Ed O'Keefe was having an interview while Bernie was running, right? It's cold. It takes a lot to show up when it's -5. I think that's what Finn said. A few people make a lot of difference in Iowa because it's so few people. And y'all talk about viability. I saw the class you were doing, the tutorial earlier about how to become viable. A number here and a number there changes things with just like 3 people, not hundreds of people like you need or thousands in New Hampshire. So every little bit starts adding up. And where this caucus goes, Iowa, New Hampshire, or even down the road to South Carolina, a few hundred votes, a few thousand votes make a big difference.
So you think this could have a psychological lift for Haley, but not DeSantis? This is a Haley conversation. The Chris Christie out is a Haley conversation.
Presidential campaigns are about momentum. And always about momentum. I try to tell people all the time when they're like, well, what happened to Bernie and what happened with Biden? Biden won races on Super Tuesday that he had no staff in 4 years ago because the momentum was just with him. That same momentum today is with Nikki Haley.
Very good. Chuck Rocha, Mara Gillespie, thank you so much for your time. Hunter Biden made a surprise visit to Capitol Hill today. We'll explain why. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Hunter Biden crashed a House hearing this morning as Republicans push to hold him in contempt of Congress. The president's son attended a meeting of the House Oversight Committee for less than 30 minutes before walking out. Last month, Hunter Biden defied House Republicans' subpoena for closed-door testimony in the impeachment inquiry into his father. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins us now from Capitol Hill. Scott, for those who didn't see it, didn't catch it on their phones midday, what happened with Hunter Biden and how surprising was this?
Major, in a building with very few genuine surprises, this was a big one. Democrats on this panel didn't know it was coming, they say. So many Republicans on this panel told me they didn't know this was coming. They were meeting today to do a markup of this effort to formally recommend Hunter Biden be recommended to be held in criminal contempt of Congress, potentially prosecuted for snubbing their subpoena. And the day they're going to have that vote and that debate, Hunter Biden shows up, sits in the front row, and he told CBS News he'd be willing to take the witness table if they let him. House Republicans blocked Democrats' efforts to have Hunter Biden testify right then, right there, saying that is not the proper procedure, that Hunter Biden doesn't get special treatment. He has to follow the committee rules. So a marathon debate ensued. The committee prepared to continue to recommend contempt of Congress for Hunter Biden. But that really is the fundamental issue here, Major. Hunter Biden has been unambiguous over the recent months, saying he's not going to meet with this committee unless he do it publicly out in the open, that he doesn't trust his information. His testimony won't be misconstrued or misappropriated if he does this behind closed doors. So the standoff continues, and the recommendation for contempt of Congress findings against Hunter Biden will push forward.
Scott, it's always tempting for reporters to be asked to be theater critics, but this was a theatrical moment. this was something clearly put together by Hunter Biden's team to, if not shift the dynamic, at least say, I can play my own PR game in public. Is that how it struck you?
It's quite a counterpunch he threw today. This was a day where the news out of this hearing was going to be the House Oversight Committee saying Hunter Biden was stonewalling. Instead, the news is about Hunter Biden showing up, ready to testify. So he's changed the narrative. And ultimately, I brought that question to two Republicans, Tim Burchett of Tennessee and Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. If this was a stunt, was it an effective stunt? Because those not paying attention at home are watching you recommend contempt of Congress for Hunter Biden, even though he's sitting right there in the room. And their answer was less than clear. They say that Hunter Biden does have to follow the rules in their minds, no matter how it looks on camera today. A counterpunch by Hunter Biden, potentially an effective one.
And very quickly, Scott, there were some things that happened within the House Republican Conference writ large about floor activity. Catch us up on that.
Well, if it feels like we've seen this show before, it's because we have. Just like happened twice late in 2023, they are getting close to a government shutdown deadline. And as the House leadership, the new House Speaker works on a deal with Democrats to keep the government open, he's got a faction of his conference that don't like it. Today, they withheld their votes on procedural baseline matters in protest, and the stalemate ensues.
So that would be filed under dysfunction, Part 17, possibly. Scott MacFarlane on Capitol Hill, we thank you very much. The judge overseeing Donald Trump's civil fraud trial will not let the former president deliver his own closing arguments. The reasoning next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Donald Trump will be back in court in New York tomorrow for closing arguments in his civil fraud trial, revolving around the Trump Organization. Former president sought to commandeer part of his team's final remarks, but the judge presiding over the case rejected that request. CBS News campaign reporter Katrina Kaufman joins us now. Katrina, there's an old saying in legal circles that, if I get this right, anyone who represents himself in court has a fool for a client. That's just a general joke. I'm not applying that to the former president. But clearly there was some give and take about this and an effort for the former president to sort of maybe grab center stage, and the judge did not permit it. Catch us up on exactly how this played out.
You know, it's a pretty interesting interaction that happened because the judge in this case, Judge Engoron, really was considering letting Trump partake in his own closing arguments. Trump's team put it out there that he was going to be part of their closing argument discussion, and Judge Engoron said he looked into it, that he actually realized it was up to his discretion, and that he was open to hearing what Trump had to say because Trump is really the one with the most at stake in this trial, but he had to put limitations on it because closing arguments are really about legal theory. So Trump had to stick to relevant topics. He couldn't testify. He couldn't make this a campaign speech. He couldn't introduce new evidence, and Trump's team just could not agree to those terms.
In other words, the judge said, if, Mr. Former President, you stick to the facts, the law, evidence presented, and within those guardrails, I'll permit it. But if you can't, I won't permit it. And they could not, that is to say the Trump legal team, confidently tell the judge their client, the former president of the United States, would stay within those boundaries.
That's correct. And there was even, I think, a final email from Judge Engoron to Christopher Keyes, Trump's attorney, and he said, you know, can you agree to my terms? You have 7 minutes left. He'd given them multiple extensions on the deadline, and they wouldn't respond affirmatively. I also thought it was interesting in this email exchange that Trump also tried to get yet another delay in this trial. You know, his wife's mother passed away, which obviously is a hard thing. But during this discussion, they also tried to push these arguments, which is just a tactic we're seeing over and over again in all of these cases.
And Katrina, remind our audience what's at stake for the former president in this particular civil matter.
The stakes are high. The Attorney General is asking for $370 million. Originally, she was asking for $250, but they've now upped that. They also want a lifetime ban on Trump participating in real estate in New York, as well as shorter bans for his sons. So For someone who's made their name as a real estate mogul, as a businessman in New York, this is very personal for Trump, and it could have really huge ramifications.
Katrina Kaufman, thank you so much for your expertise. Coming up next, we discuss the changes to the Republican presidential field, looking at you, Christie, with our political panel. They're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie has suspended his 2024 White House campaign. I am delighted to bring back, because they haven't left me here at the table, giving me all sorts of intellectual and emotional guidance and sustenance, Mara Gillespie and Chuck Rocha. So, Mara, how do you think this event, this development, Chris Christie dropping out, will be viewed within the Trump world? Consequential, inconsequential?
I'm sure they're already saying, you know, of course he should have dropped out earlier. Why was he even in it? Blah, 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 blah. All those things. We're probably going to already see that on X, Twitter, whatever. But I think one thing that I would point out what he's talked about was when he apologized for, in 2016, I did let ambition govern my decision making. I was wrong. But the members who have since supported Trump, knowing all that they know now, they will eventually have to answer for it. And I think that's a really interesting point for the GOP, because while Trump world is going to hit on him for being, you know, wishy-washy, a flip-flop, or whatever they're going to say about him, because
a rhino, which, sloppy, all the things that they have said seriatim about the former governor.
They're going to make fun of him for all the things that Trump does. But beyond this moment, it will be a question for the GOP to look at. Trump will not live forever. So what happens beyond this moment? You know, when Trump is no longer in the picture, people will have to answer for it. And there's a lot of things that have come out, a lot of things that have happened. There's a lot of court cases still going on. And it's going to be one of those moments that maybe a career for someone like a Tom Emmer isn't as short, or is it now short because he put his support behind Trump? And so I think he brought up a good point, kind of a little ominous warning to some members who are either in politics now or looking to be in politics. You'll have to answer for it.
You know better. I know you know better.
I knew better, and I made a mistake.
Right.
I'm sorry. But here's what's the reality we're at now. So you will all have to answer for it.
Or as you remember in 2016, I certainly do, because I was on the campaign trail continuously, there was this constant conversation that went in no practical direction. Well, if we could only consolidate the field, and it never consolidated, or by the time it did, it was too late.
It's too late.
Do you, from your tactical perspective, is the field consolidating faster and in a way that could make Trump's path to the nomination more complicated than it currently appears?
I think the numbers in New Hampshire, again, I'll point this out again, that it is different. It feels a little different. The fact that Nikki Haley has continued to boost her numbers there, as opposed to going in the negative direction. There are a lot of questions surrounding Trump, and the fact Iowa doesn't always really equate to our nominee. We've learned that in countless cycles. And again, the fact that he is technically our incumbent and his numbers still aren't, you know, I think Joe Biden's polling somewhere around 60+%, and he's not even on the ballot in New Hampshire. And Trump's not. That should tell us a little bit that there is an opportunity to make headway there.
Chuck, you've talked about your experience in campaigns. When one thing happens over here, it has an energetic effect over here. And it's not always clear what's going to happen. Things bounce around a little bit. But what's your sense of how this is going to bounce around in the next 48 hours?
I think that...
Or maybe let me answer different. If you were DeSantis or Haley, what would you be doing in the next 48 hours to make sure this energy in any way, shape, or form benefits you?
They know because they've been doing IDs in this state. And the first thing they do is they start calling their IDs that were with the guy that just dropped out. So
although in Christie's case in Iowa, that's probably 4 people.
That's fine. And in New Hampshire, it's more than that, right?
Much more than that, right.
And they know who they are. And for folks at home, we know who these voters are because they've spent a lot of time calling each one of them, like you can do in New Hampshire.
So in New Hampshire, the Haley campaign is lighting up the phones tonight.
So there was people that had been having conversations for 4 or 6 months, and we knew that they were a lean this person. They were with Chris Christie. They'll go back to them first, and then they will start a targeted ad to those people via digital advertising. But over the long term, let's be clear about the implications with Democrats. As a Democrat, I want Donald Trump to be the nominee. I do not want a Nikki Haley. I do not want anybody but Donald Trump as a Democrat because we beat him before, we can beat him again, and he's so divisive. And there's so many things that are unknown with these court cases that you've been covering, with that coupled with, will it really consolidate? It's going to consolidate some. But Donald Trump, in my humble opinion, after 34 years of doing this, is going to be the nominee. The question is, what does he do with her vote? And does he bring her in to be the VP? There's a lot of things up in there that nobody knows.
I want to ask you, Chuck, setting aside Governor Christie, important though it was, for a moment. I've talked to Democrats since Friday. President's speech near Valley Forge and then at Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, who said, I have seen in those two speeches and I have heard a different President Biden. I believe the campaign has now been kicked into gear. And I'm now feeling differently, not necessarily that they were on the fence. They were Biden supporters before, but they feel better about the prospects and what they saw. Is that something that you have heard? Is that something you fundamentally believe? Did something happen in those two speeches that wasn't there before?
Look, in every campaign, you want to get through the holidays. And then you want to kick off the campaign in the beginning of the year. Sharpening is what the Biden campaign said. They said they weren't launching. They said they were going to sharpen their tone. Well, in focus groups that I was doing in December, Democrats, I'm sure the campaign was doing the same thing, want to see him being more assertive, being more quote unquote tough or louder about the opposition and what you've done and brag about what he's done. And I think that's what you've seen in the sharpening quote unquote of the message, which you have to do as we move into a primary where Republicans will take up all the space because they're having a primary. And we're sitting here talking about it. You can't lose fact of that, what Joe Biden has done and what the campaign is trying to do.
As a Republican, Mara, did you detect anything, a stronger spring in Biden's steps, something rhetorically that was there that wasn't there before?
I think the 2024 election is for the Republicans to lose. And it's kind of well, finally, he stepped up to campaign. I've been wondering where he's been. And I do think there's a lot of questions that people have, not just Republicans, but who's in charge of the White House? Who is in charge?
And the defense secretary's situation does not provide any reassurance there.
And I do think that's going to be a question going into the election. Now, again, we are 10 months away or whatever it may be. So there is some time for the narrative to change a little bit. But that certainly didn't help this couple of the situation. And again, I think it's the Republicans to lose. And to your point, if we pick Donald Trump, we will lose.
That is the final word. Mara Gillespie, Chuck Rocha, thank you for not just one, but two panel sessions. I do appreciate it very much. That does it for today. You are streaming CBS News.